Hello and welcome to this lab demonstration on configuring vSphere distributed switch. After completing this lab video, we will be able to create a distributed switch, add hosts to a new distributed switch, to examine a distributed switch configuration, and to migrate VMs to a distributed switch port group. At the beginning of this lab, we already need to be familiar with the concept of standard and distributed virtual switches. I'm sure I provided you enough good reasons to watch the following video on configure vSphere distributed switch. So let's get started. At first, we need to navigate to a networking page in our vSphere client. On our shortcuts page, we can choose either networking section on the left navigation pane, or we can choose a networking section in inventories in shortcuts, or we can just simply choose a menu and find the networking section here. So let's click on it. Here we can see our networking environment for both our vCenters. Now we need to go to our SA-VCSA01 vCenter, and please keep in mind that we need to create a distributed virtual switch on a data center level. So our data center is called SA data center, Site A data center. Let's right click on it and choose an option which is called distributed switch, and next we need to choose new distributed switch. A new distributed switch creation wizard has been launched. Now we need to set a name for our new distributed switch. Let's call it DVS-lab. And then we need to click next. Now we need to choose a version of this distributed switch. We are going to use the latest available version here, which is for ESXi 7.0. Let's click next. Now, we need to choose the number of abstract app links of this particular virtual switch. We are going to leave this option set by default equals to 4. We are going to set the default option for network input-output control enabled. And we are going to create a default port group, our first port group, for this particular distributed virtual switch. Let's give it a name like PGSA Site A production. We are going to use this particular port group a bit later in this particular lab. So let's click next. Now we can summarize the information which we have already provided. For this particular wizard, our DVS will be called DVS Lab. It will have a 7.0 version, and it will have a default port group, which we have called a PGSA production. So let's click Finish here. Now we can see that our DVS has been successfully created, and we can see a port group, which is called PGSA production, also successfully created in this particular virtual switch. Now we need to configure this particular virtual switch and its port group. We need to assign some uplinks, some abstract at first uplinks to this particular virtual switch and its port groups. So let's click on our port group PGSA production. Let's right click it and let's click an Edit Settings button. Here we can see again the set of default settings for our port group. Let's find the section which is called Teaming and Failover. Here we can find that by default this wizard allows us to set all 4 configured abstract app links from 1 to 4 as active app links for this particular port group. We do not need this during this lab. We are going to use only uplink number 1 during our next lab. So we are going to set our uplink 2, uplink 3 and uplink 4 as unused uplinks. I just need to click on it and to navigate them by pressing the arrow button. I need to do this for all my app links except app link number 1. And then I need to click OK to apply this configuration to my port group. So now we can proceed with task number 2, where we are going to actually add our E6i host to this particular switch. This switch has already been created, but currently it does not have any E6i host associated with it. So we are going to add some hosts to this particular virtual switch. What we are going to do? We need to again find our DVS. We need to click on it with our right mouse button. Now we need to find the section which is called Add and Manage Hosts. Let's click on it. And now we have a wizard launched which is called Add and Manage Hosts. Let's do it. Let's choose an option which is called Add Hosts. Let's click Next. Now we need to add some hosts to this particular virtual switch. Let's click New Hosts. And now we are going to choose 5 of our E6i hosts from 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6. Let's click OK. Now let's click Next. Now we need to choose which virtual machine network interface cards, or VMNICs, are going to be used as our uplink number 1, which we have chosen as an active uplink during our previous steps. So let's find our, for example, VMNIC number 2. Let's associate it with the uplink number 2. Let's choose, for example, our E6i host number 1. Let's click and assign uplink button. Now we need to choose our uplink number 1, which is set to active state. And we can also click the next checkbox, apply this uplink assignment to the rest of the hosts, in order for us not to repeat this step 5 times. So let's click it and click OK. Now, our VMNIC number 2 is assigned to an abstract uplink number 1 of our DVS lab. Let's double check that our other E6i hosts have the same configuration. Uplink number 1 for VMNIC 2 in E6i 02, 04, 05, and 06. Yes. All VNICs number 2 are assigned to uplink number 1. Let's click Next. Currently we are going to skip managing VM kernel adapters. We are not going to migrate them or assign them to this particular DVS. So let's click Next. Again, we are going to migrate some virtual machines a bit lately to this particular DVS. So again, let's skip this step right now. And now we can click a Finish button in our procedure of adding 5 hosts to our DVS. Let's click Finish. In our next task, we are going to examine some features of our newly created DVS. So at first, let's click on our DVS switch. Let's go to a Configure tab of our DVS. And now let's see which actual hosts were added to our DVS. Let's click on the topology section. Here we can see that a PGSA production port group is created for this particular DVS. We have an uplink number 1 with 5 NICs adapters associated with it. Let's unwrap this section, and here we can see our 5 VMNICs number 2 from E6i 0, 2, 4, 5, and 6 added to this particular uplink number 1. Next, let's see what other options, what other configuration options our DVS can have. Let's click on the Properties section. Here we can see again the name of our DVS. We can see a version which we have previously chosen during the creation of this virtual switch, we can see the number of uplinks. Please keep in mind, we have only one active logical uplink, uplink number 1, and 3 other uplinks were set to unused state by us. We can see some advanced configuration options of this particular DVS. For example, an MTU, maximum transmission unit, is set to a default value which equals to 500 bytes. I'm sorry. Also, we can see a configured discovery protocol, which is by default set to Cisco Discovery Protocol, or CDP in short, and its operational state is listen. So our DVS is only going to listen some incoming CDP packets from our physical switches to which our ESXi hosts can be attached. Also, let's see some other configuration options here. For example, let's see that our LECP protocol can be configured for this particular DVS in a section which is called LECP, Link Aggregation Control Protocol. No entries are currently here. We are not going to add some physical ports to link aggregation bundles right now. We can see that the section of private VLANs is clean right now. We haven't created any private VLAN objects during our previous steps. The NetFlow section was not configured for this particular tool for us to be able to collect some network flow statistics between our VMs or between our VMs and some outside objects. Port mirroring was not configured right now during our creation steps, and some health checks are set to disabled. We are not going to use them right now. Now let's go to our PGSA production port group. Let's see which properties can be found by us for this particular port group. Again, in some properties section, we can see some general options for our port group. Its name, its port binding method, which is by default set to static binding. Let's see that our port allocation method is configured as elastic, and a number of ports which are associated with this particular port group is set to 8. Now we are going to proceed with our next task, where we are going to actually test our DVS and our newly created port group by migrating 2 virtual machines to this particular port group, and then we are going to test some network connectivity by a basic ping procedure. So let's do it. I'm going to migrate 2 virtual machines from another pre-created DVS in this lab. The pre-created DVS is called DVS SA Data Center. I'm going to migrate some virtual machines from its port group, which is called PGSA Management. What I'm going to do, I need to choose a PGSA Management port group. Let's migrate some virtual machines from it to our newly created port group. Let's choose and migrate VMs to another network. The wizard of VM migration has been launched. Here I can see that my PGSA management port group is automatically set as a source network, and I need to choose a destination network where I need to migrate my VMs. Let's click the browse button to choose a destination network. Here we need to click on our PGSA production, our newly created port group from our DVS lab. Let's click OK. Now we need to click Next. And now we need to choose VMs, which we are going to migrate to our PGSA production port group. We need to choose both Linux 1 and Linux 2 virtual machines. Let's click Next. And let's verify that we are going to migrate 2 virtual machines from PGSA management port group to PGSA production port group. Let's click Finish. In the bottom of the screen, we can see the actual procedure of migration. Both migration procedures have been completed for Linux 1 and Linux 2. Now let's check whether our networking configuration was correct. So let's go to Hosts and Clusters section. Let's see for our Linux 01 VM, for example. We are going to power it on. Power on. We need to wait a bit for this virtual machine to actually boot. Let's launch a web console to Linux 01 virtual machine. Now we are going to wait a bit for this particular VM to boot for us to be able to ping. Just a couple of seconds. And now we need to actually log into this virtual machine. Let's use a username root. Let's use a password from a lab guide. And now we are logged in. So let's ping some test IP address. For our purposes, we are going to ping an address which is 172.20.10.10 for 3 times. And we can see 3 successful pings from our Linux 01 virtual machines. If we are not able to ping this particular address, this may be because of misconfigured IP address of this virtual machine. This virtual machine must accept its IP address by DHCP protocol. So we can, for example, if our pings are unsuccessful and our previous steps were configured correctly, we have completed our previous steps correctly, we may need to try to restart network services on this virtual machine by typing a command service network restart. And after that, we can actually try to ping this particular IP address again, and it should be successful. So our task number 4 is completed. Congratulations, you have completed the Configure vSphere Distributed Switch lab demonstration video. During this lab, we have seen how and where we can create a distributed virtual switch, by which steps we can add ESXi hosts to it, which configuration options can be configured on a virtual switch, and how we can migrate existing VMs to a newly created distributed switch. Thank you for watching this lab demonstration video. I hope the knowledge acquired here will help you with your daily job assignments, and good luck as you continue your journey in VMware world.